when I first heard about it, I thought it was really exciting that Leeds Carnival Committee was applying a new initiative to get more young people involved. At the time, I have to admit that I was a little bit hesitant about getting involved because I thought a residency would be an opportunity to just use the resources of a young person to work with me whilst I'm doing my normal work. But this year, I had already done all my usual work and had done a lot of subcontracting with another company in London. So I wasn't doing any work in Leeds specifically around the time of the residency. So I thought, okay, long and hard about it. I thought, okay, fine, well, here's an opportunity to get another young person involved with Carnival. So maybe I should make that effort. So I thought long and hard about it. I spoke to a few people who I thought might be interested. And when I came across Hughbon, I know from past experience in working with him, he's definitely enthusiastic about Carnival. And when I mentioned it to him and his dad, they were both very, very, very much excited about this opportunity. So I thought, well, okay, what does this really involve? Because as a professional and someone who's been doing it for 50 plus years, I realized that I would be shortchanging them if I didn't do it properly. So I decided to develop a program specifically looking at how I can transfer some of my skills to Hughbon within the limited time scale that was available. Bearing in mind, I'm talking about when I first started in Carnival, it took me something like 8 years before I made my first winning Carnival Queen costume. So it was a very, very long apprentice. And here we are now talking about residency with a couple of months. I think one of the good things about the situation, though, was that because I didn't have any additional work on, I was able to then spend basically all my time with Hughbon, or like on a one-to-one basis. And I was able to then talk him through a program that I would normally use when I'm doing workshops with other people, but also show him the whole process of making Carnival costumes. Now, when I say the whole process, obviously, everyone's got their own style and technique, so I'm not claiming to know everything about other people's style and technique, but it's more about the way we, in High Esteem Carnival Design, make costumes. And obviously, we are renowned for making big, structured costumes, and that's what we tend to excel at. So clearly, that's what I thought it'd be good to sort of share how we go about making those kind of costumes at Hughbon. In terms of the process I used, I started off with, firstly, ensuring that Hughbon understands the whole concept behind Carnival. And so I encouraged him to do his own research on the internet, looking at the likes of the history of Leeds Carnival. Clearly, there's a lot of materials on it. With Arthur France being very much inclusive as one of the founder members of Carnival. But I also encourage him to look at Carnival on a much wider basis in terms of carnivals in Trinidad, in the Bahamas, and up and down the world in terms of other carnivals. So he had an opportunity then to at least have some perspective of Carnival per se. Having done that, we then started to look at what he wanted to do as a design. Now, interestingly enough, he said that he wanted to design a costume around High Esteem. Now, High Esteem is the name of our company. And I just thought, well, that's pretty clever, sort of mentioning High Esteem. But in essence, he also looked at High Esteem in terms of the way one feels about oneself in terms of having a high esteem. So I said, great, well, let's do some designs and see what you come up with. And I will give him full credit. He has got some really good ideas in terms of designs, and he did produce about 3 or 4 designs. And we looked critically at them, and I then applied the next process in terms of what I do with development of costumes, and that is to look at 10 factors one must consider before making a costume. Okay? I'm not going to go through all 10 of them at the moment, but clearly I started looking at those in terms of what he wanted to design. And So he had the freedom to design what he wanted, and we then looked critically at 3 of the designs and said, well, okay, what we want you to do now is to make a small model of those designs. Now that took quite some time making these small models. And again, I was encouraging him to think about some of the factors that you need to take in consideration with the models. It's about making sure the costume is balanced on the person, that it's not all at the back or at the front, so it becomes unwieldy or difficult to wear. Colors certainly was not a factor in terms of that particular stage of design. It was more about structure and the ability to carry it and comfort. So, like I said, I encourage him to build 3 models on these, which you can probably see a bit later on. And we then had a close look at all 3 models, looking at the strengths and weaknesses, again taking into consideration the factors that one needs to consider in making a costume. And certainly in Hughbon's case, it was more the fact that we had a certain limited amount of space to work in. And because he hasn't got a workshop, he's having to now work from home. And it's about looking at how one can make a costume that would give him the opportunity of doing work at home, but at the same time can be put together to have a really good showing. So we came up and decided that that particular design was the one that we should make. So when you look at his drawings and then we look at the model, we had to make some alterations, some changes. And that's quite natural because you then, once you draw something, it's easy to make it whatever you want. But once you start making it to a scale, you begin to understand some of the limitations in doing it. And so he made the small model. And the next process then was about how do you go about scaling up that model to a full-size costume as you have here in the background. So again, one learning process was about understanding how to do that. And I think it took a little time before Hughbon understood, but he finally got it, that there is a ratio that you look at from the scale model to the full-size model. And I was quite intrigued in one of his later comments that when we actually got to this size, he said, oh, I can't believe it's so big, but really, if you look at the model, it is very much in scale with the size of the person. So whilst he was very much surprised, I wasn't, because that's what we had in terms of a model. One of the things we had to consider was the availability of materials. For example, the biggest circle that he has in this particular design was just over 3 meters diameter. And I suggested that maybe we should reduce it to 3 meters. In that way, we don't have to sew and join the fabric to get the full circle. And it didn't really matter that much that it was just slightly bigger than the model. Having done that, we also then began to look again critically at those 10 elements that he needed to consider when designing and making costumes. So we then begin to look at how can we then assemble this costume in a way that will allow him to have a really big costume on the road, but can be pulled apart and stored in a very small space. So we were able to achieve that by using a standard backpack, which he mentioned earlier, in terms of the way it fits over the shoulder. And now that's a design that we have developed in high esteem, where we have a fairly standard backpack that will fit a sort of fairly size range in terms of maybe say size 8 to about size 16 or so. Obviously smaller you need a slightly change of size, or slightly bigger you need a slightly bigger backpack. But generally speaking, this backpack will cover 90% of the people that we normally make costumes for. But having said that as well, one of the things that we also discussed was the various backpacks that can be used. Once we decided to use this one for this design, I've also exposed him to the other designs that we use for other costumes. But we also spoke about the different materials as well that was available. So, if you just said, if you look at the drawing and it was a line that long, the question is, well, what material should you use for that? And it would very much depend on how it's connected, does it need to be permanently connected, what fits on it, is it along this length, or is it at the side, or is it at the end? And all those things need to be taken into consideration when designing and looking at materials. So it wasn't just a question of simply, using the first bit of fiberglass that you came across. It's about understanding why you would use that, say, opposed to carbon fiber or steel or aluminium or a bit of wood or a bit of bamboo, or even a bit of string. So it very much depends on what you want that particular length of thing to be made from. So there's obviously lots of things that were taken into consideration when we went along to produce this costume. One of the other things that we did deviate from was that on his model he had like a full skirt at the back. And now I'm telling you that skirts at the back of costumes is typical of most designers in terms of what they do. It's a nice way of covering the back, and in the case of female, covering their modesty, which is really nice. And it often gives a really good display. But I suggested that maybe he should use a slightly different approach because he wanted to have the clouds, and so we were able to continue to use kind of round shapes along the back to give a similar kind of skirt effect without it being a single skirt. And again, that allows us the opportunity to then have multiple bits that can fit in, create a complete skirt, but taken apart and then be stacked and put away on its own. In terms of actually making the costumes, one of the things that I wanted Hughbon to do was to sew the circles on here. And I'm telling you, sewing circles is one of the most difficult part of making costumes because to sew a little hem around the circle is difficult. And my wife, Gloria, she has mastered that because I have challenged her with that on many other previous designs. When Hughbon first did it, I said, well, no, we need to get some expert help here. So Gloria was able to spend some time with Hughbon to show him how it's done. He then went away, did some, came back, we looked at it, commented, suggested what else he needs to do. And we got to a point where, he did make the circles pretty good. So that particular element, he can claim definitely his work, is what he's learned, is what he's done. And I would say he's done a really good job with that. And as he said in his earlier interview, it's a skill he can now take away and use in his fashion design, work. One of the other things that I also had to do was I got my partner and son, Seth, to also get involved. He then looked at the finishing and body costume and the headpiece. So he was very much responsible for designing and making the headpiece and adding the trims and decorations to make it complete. Because quite often that area of interest of costumes is what often cameras zoom in on. And quite often they miss the bigger picture, but just look specifically at that. So exactly, so it's important that is done properly. So Seth was able to spend a lot of time with Hughbon, suggesting ways of doing it and encouraging him to think critically about how it's best to decorate it. I think the most key is understanding what the parameters are, because if space is not a problem, then you don't need to make a costume that needs to be pulled apart. If space is a problem, then you need to consider that as being a big factor. The cost of the costume is a factor. If you have a very small budget, you have to be creative and think, how can I best create something with that? If you have a very big budget, then yeah, you can experiment and buy in the best decorations and so on. So it is very much understanding what the parameters are that you're working around. Sometimes you're given a particular theme. So you need to spend a lot of time researching that and making sure that you understand it and you're producing the work that fits with the theme. For me, one of the key things in terms of this type of design is to be able to create a small model that you can critique and look and communicate with others, because even with a drawing, quite often it's flat and you cannot see at the back of it. And when you're speaking to someone else about it, then when you describe something, you may say certain words that you think fits the description, but I might hear other words that fits the description that isn't quite the same. Whereby with a model, you can look critically at it and get a sense of size and feel and how it's likely to behave. So for me, the key is always be able to communicate your ideas via a model to enable you to be confident about when you start building the finished product as to its size and cost and weight and all of those good other factors. Well, I think the initiative of having residency is excellent. Certainly, I don't think Leeds had one before. Certainly not that I can remember in the last 50 years since I've been involved with Carnival. So I would say excellent bit of initiative there in terms of residency. It was left very much to each designer or each group to decide how they develop that residency. Again, that is okay. And I think what Leeds Carnival should do now is probably look at the best practice and see how they can amalgamate them together to get the best output. In terms of bursary as a company, then certainly that has not been an incentive for me. Clearly, the amount of bursary I've got, I could have earned that in one day's workshop, and I've spent weeks, with Hughbon just developing, his skill set and producing this particular model. So from my viewpoint, it's not a major, it wasn't a major incentive. In fact, it was not an incentive. But I suppose from Hughbon's point of view, maybe he can comment on that. But I would imagine it's good that young people could have some funding that would help to certainly purchase the materials. That's something we need to still need to cover in terms of how much material is being used and so on. And it's good that they can have some funding while spending the time making costumes. Clearly, that's a wonderful thing to have. It's something I've never had, but it doesn't mean that others shouldn't. And so, if it's available, then yeah, great. One of the things that I also try and create whilst doing this residency is to create a kind of work ethics whilst doing it. It's not a question of just coming and doing what you feel like when you feel like. It was about having a specific program and timekeeping is like, we'll start at a given time and expect it to be there on time, And so for me, that was also part of the learning process. And the thing about Carnival is that no matter what your excuse is, Carnival is on a given day. And so you need to have your costume finished on that given day. So often you need to make sacrifices. I mean, giving one example, there was the weekend just before the actual carnival where there was the option of going to another carnival on their parade. And the question, I had to ask Hughbon the question, well, do you want to go and experience another carnival or do you want to make sure that you have your costume finished? And he quite rightly said, I want to make sure my costume's finished. So he's had to sacrifice going to another carnival. Now, if it started earlier and he would plan that in, he could have made sure he had enough capacity to both do the other carnival and get his costume completed. So there's other elements apart from the design, which is also necessary and important to understand and include in the residency in terms of the way the young person approaches it. I think this took just over 2 months, but clearly a lot of shortcut took place. I mean, for example, making the backpack involved the welding. So Hughbon didn't have an opportunity to do any welding himself. I mean, obviously, he's only young, and so therefore, health and safety and so on came into play. But, I have worked with other designers as well who have just got a pre-made backpack anyway, so it was not, it wasn't anything totally different in terms of what I would do with other people. So, I mean, developing that skill set is it's something different, which he hasn't had an opportunity of doing. He was able to cut materials using a hacksaw, and you can tell he hasn't done it before. So, even just doing that was a good learning experience. I think this time scale, was a little bit inhibitive in terms of what you can and can't do. And so I would say that if we were going to repeat this, it would make sense to have created a base program that all of the internees or the young people can get involved with. And each designer can then cover their own aspects or skill sets to ensure that everyone get the same lesson. Yeah. And then later on, they can start specializing. I mean, for example, I know there were other designers who were very good, at doing the feather work and the gem work. And, it's definitely a wonderful craft. But, it is very specific. And people may just want to do that anyway, which is fine. But I think as a general knowledge, as a general sort of education, I think it's important that one has a bigger view of Carnival and to be able to be more creative because they have a wider sense of what's available and what isn't available. I think what they need to look at is what what experience the young people have gained from this particular program. I mean, certainly Ruben has had, working with me, his own experience, but I know that other designers and other young people have worked with other designers, and so it'd be good to sort of see, what they saw as being, valuable learning, and try and encapsulate all of that into one program. Like I say, they would make sense to have the benefits of grouping, so that for each person presenting can present to more than one person at a time. Okay, I think it would make sense to ensure that the presenters are properly compensated, so to speak, in terms of the work that they do. So yeah, but our program can be developed to ensure other people, have got that kind of basic understanding and experience, so that they feel confident to move forward and start doing their own work. I think that having a residency is definitely a big plus. So I would say, top marks for that. In my particular case, I think Ruben has been fortunate that I had the capacity to do that kind of detail support and learning and education that took place. I would imagine that it would be different if everyone was extremely busy and it was a question of simply using the residency to acquire some cheap labor to learn some very basic skills. And that's always another risk, okay? But I see it as more of an initial sort of testing ground. So I'm hoping that the learning that can take place from the Leeds residency can be put together and a better program be established next year and future years to come. I would make sure that the person who's delivering the training is properly compensated. I'm not going to knock it too much because it's a first-off initiative, and so I welcome that opportunity. But for future, I would say definitely that needs to be turned around, so to speak. I don't ever sort of think of anything being a secret. I think what is very clear is that, firstly, I enjoy what I do, and so I don't make any excuses about the time and expense that I take in delivering. Secondly, I like to produce good quality work, and so I'm in this process of continual development, continual improvement, and that's my approach to Carnival. And that stands to be correct in as much as my first winning Carnival costume was back in 1979. And 2019, I'm still making winning Carnival Queen costumes. So, I'd like to think that I remain fresh and current and always try and create designs that's not been done before. And just the opportunity to be creative. And I just love that. So that's what I do. Ruben mentioned the clouds, and I have to say that I love the clouds as well. In as much as I asked Ruben to design the clouds, having shown him the process that we're going to use to spray them. And I was very much impressed, with the designs that he used. to get the edges of the cloud. If anything, I did suggest he use more than 3, but he just seemed to be happy with 3. So maybe just a bit more would be useful. But yeah, I would think the cloud effect is excellent. And it's something that I'd want to develop more to ensure that I can create a much more dramatic cloud effect. I mean, as it is, the cloud is really nice and airy, but it'd be great if you can then use the same technique to create more drama in terms of its appearance. So that's something I'd like to see develop. Yeah.